EJ and I will talk for maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up and people can come in as they'd like. We are recording it, so just to beware, but it also is a good thing because you'll be able to share this with people on the Ash Center YouTube site. Okay, so in the sense that Tova Wang and I have been doing a study group on democracy agenda issues, and they've all been conversations with people in the field. And Tova, I want to say that Tova has been an absolute pleasure to work with. She's knowledgeable, she's in the movement. And for those of you who are study group participants, we're definitely going to be doing this again next fall. Hopefully not remotely, but we'll see. Anyway, thanks very much, Tova, and thank you for participating. At our last session, I was the question retriever for Tova, who was the host. So we're flipping roles here. But secondly, this is also part of a series of events that the Ash Center is going to be holding about our democracy and about how it is being affected by the virus. And secondly, to kind of look forward to what our democracy might look like. What do we learn from the period of COVID-19, and how can we go forward? So this is sort of a combination of an Ash Center public event and our study group. So this is great. And it's there's no question that the virus is causing a tremendous amount of conversation about our democracy. I would say twofold. One is that there's lots and lots of discussion going on, argumentation, advocacy, resistance to what are we going to do in November? How are we going to have a fully participatory election in November? How can people be secure and confident in the outcome? How can they be confident that they will be able to vote and vote safely? So that's a lot of what's going on now, and lots of people are really seriously looking at that. But at the same time, you know, there's also a discussion to be had about what is our democracy going to look like. I hesitate to say after the virus, because my feeling now is that it will be with us in one way or another for a very long time. But we're certainly going to get beyond, hopefully, the acute moment. And then we're going to need to figure out what is it that our democracy could look like. I actually think it's going to be an opening for some really creative thinking. And I know that our colleagues at the Ash Center really want to do that. And I think it's going to be a creative debate at which things, like they are going to be, I think, in many aspects of our society, are going to open up, and new ideas are going to be on the table, and people are going to be thinking about different ways to structure things because we had to of necessity, and so it shows that it's possible. Anyway, one piece of that debate is going to be full participation, and that's the kind of discussion for today. And we are, speaking of creative thinkers and creative ideas for the session, for the future rather, we are really fortunate to have EJ Dionne with us today. I looked at his bio, and with a great deal of triaging and editing, I'm limiting myself to a mere 7 salient points about and who he is. One, he's a senior fellow and the director of the Democracy and Public Policy program at the Brookings Institution, and that he has been there for a very long time. Number 2, as everybody knows, he's a widely syndicated columnist in the Washington Post, and also a frequent and really thoughtful presence in the media. He is the professor of the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown. That's 3 if anybody's counting. He's also the professor of religion and political culture at Harvard. He has a joint appointment with the Kennedy School and the Divinity School. Number 5, he's the author of a fabulous book, which I happen to have, called Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. And since we haven't charged admission for this event, going out and buying the book on Amazon and having it delivered by drone would be a great thing to do. And EJ, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the book in a minute. But 6, he is the co-director, co-chair, I should say, of the Universal Voting Working Group. This is a joint project of the Brookings Institution and the Ash Center at Harvard, looking at whether or not we can stimulate a genuine discussion and debate in the United States about the idea of making voting a civic duty requirement, which is a totally novel idea if you've only lived in the United States, but if you lived in Australia or 26 other countries, this is something that they've done in Australia's case for 100 years. So EJ and I have been leading this working group. We are getting ready with a report, which I think will be really interesting. The question is, how does the virus impact that? And lastly, he's a really good friend and I think a deeply committed democracy advocate. Ever since we've known each other for a long time, but since he's been at Harvard, it's been a complete pleasure, EJ, to work with you and have you as a colleague. So let's give a muted round of applause to EJ Dionne as he joins us. All right, very good, very good. All right, EJ, we'll obviously get to the question of universal voting and how we make it into an issue and how to think about it. But let me start you off with a kind of a general question about, you wrote the book earlier in the election cycle, but obviously with a point and an argument to make for people about progressives and moderates uniting in this moment. And now we have the virus and the COVID-19 cloud or storm or hurricane attached to that. So how do you think about this? What was your perspective in the book, and how is the virus on how we make our democracy function in the best way, and how does the virus affect your thinking about it all?
Well, I love Miles for many reasons, but one of them is he completely understands that somebody who has a book out desperately wants to talk about it to any audience assembled. If I could just say a couple of things first, I want to honor Amber Hurley and Roma Venkatas Warren. Amber is my assistant, although she is leaving shortly, and has been such a central figure in the working group that we'll be talking about later. And Roma has been just an awesome intern who's really helped us. I want to shout out to Tova. It's always great to be with you. And thanks to Archon Fung, who's on here somewhere, for joining us. When you were going on and on about a person with creative ideas for democracy, I thought you were going to introduce Archon. And I want to shout out Miles, because Miles, first of all, he is such an enthusiastic friend that he even gave me a title I don't have. I'm not director of anything at Brookings. I am simply a senior fellow. I always say I'm old and gray enough to be a senior fellow. But Miles has such enthusiasm, such hopefulness about the world, that I'm surprised we're not a perfect democracy now. It doesn't make sense. There is just, it is such a joy, as Tova knows, to work with Miles, because, where others see closed doors, he sees a window out the back that you can go through and figure out a way forward. So bless you, Miles. Let me just talk very briefly. There are two parts of that question, really, about the book and about how it relates to the argument now. I wrote the book because I was afraid that progressives and people I call moderates, who can have a whole argument about the word moderate, I have reasons for using that as opposed to centrist or some other words I could have used. I had great worries that, as I put it in the first sentence of the book, will progressives and moderates feud while the country burns. The core argument is that at this moment in history, not only because of President Trump, although he is certainly reason enough, but also because of the radicalization of the Republican Party to the right, at this moment in history, progressives and moderates have far more in common than they sometimes want to realize. And just to pick that progressives and moderates essentially believe that government and public life have a role to play in solving a series of problems that will simply not be solved if there is not public intervention. Unlike the radical Republicans who have shown increasingly an interest until the last month and a half in using government only for the purposes of cutting taxes and actually cutting back on regulations. They believe in expanding healthcare to everyone, and whether they are for a public option or a single payer Medicare for all plan, they all want universal coverage. Whether they are for making college and post-secondary training more widely available, whether they're for free college the way Bernie was, or something short of that, but still far more than we have now. They want to move in the same direction. Both sides want to act on climate change. And I could go down the list. I argue in particular that the radicalization of the Republican Party means that many people who might once have been moderate Republicans are now almost entirely either independents or Democrats. There are a very precious few exceptions around the country in public office. And so this means that arguments on the moderate and progressive side and within the Democratic Party are can get pretty contentious, because arguments that might once have taken place between a more moderate version of conservatism and progressives are now all happening inside the Democratic Party. I have to say that what's happened in the last several weeks with the rallying around Joe Biden, the fact that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have issued such strong endorsements, the fact that Biden himself has signaled a welcome to the progressive forces by sort of adopting in part some of the proposals that Sanders and Warren put forward, is really a promising sign, dare I say, a vindication of the argument of the book, because I thought that's where we needed to go. On the virus, I'll just say a couple of very obvious things and then a couple of questions. Obvious thing one is, no matter how much people hated government, they understood that only large-scale government action could begin to undo some of the problems in our economy, that the virus itself and the need for physical distancing, I prefer that to social distancing, but we can talk about that if you'd like. The need for distancing has required, it got all of these Republicans voting for a stimulus plan that was close to 3 times larger than the stimulus plan they opposed when Barack Obama was our president, and they seem to be negotiating today toward another $500 billion. We're talking trillions. You've got to get used to it in this period. And it was a real acknowledgement that, like government or not, when you're in a hole like this, you need it. My favorite line on this, by the way, is from a former Republican senator who later served in the Clinton administration, Bill Cohen, who once said that government is the enemy until you need a friend. And in this case, a lot of people need government as a friend. So there is that realization. The second realization is how unequal the suffering is in this crisis. I wrote a column recently where I said that economic inequality is an important but arid phrase. Unequal suffering appeals more to our humanity. And you are seeing unequal suffering across many fronts. The fact that African Americans are getting infected at much higher rates and dying at higher rates than others. The fact that working class neighborhoods in New York, which includes a lot of African Americans and Latinos, but also others, are being infected at a higher rate than in the rest of the city. The impact of the virus on young people. Imagine being a young person leaving high school or college now and entering this economy, or under last ones in, first ones out policies. If you're a young person in a job, you're probably more likely to lose it. What are we going to do to make up for the potential loss in lifetime earnings for young people? the ability to social distance, the very fact that many of us have these screens in front of us and can continue to work while many others cannot. Gallup had a study that showed that for the bottom 3 quintiles, somewhere between only 35 and I think 42% of people were able to work at home. For the top quintile, 71% have been able to work at home. Now, will these changes have a long-lasting impact? I don't know, but I do think that what may have a long-lasting impact is the fact that President Trump's failures, the failure to plan, the failure to construct a government that could respond, the failure to use warnings that he had gotten, his administration had gotten for years out of the danger of the pandemic. My very gloomy side, which is a small part of me, says, I hope this isn't what will, this won't lead to an argument that said, see, government is useless. I am hoping that this will lead a lot of Americans to say, whether we want government here or there, a functioning, effective government is vital to our very survival as a people. And that government that doesn't work, not government itself, is the enemy. And we need government that works to be our friend. And I will leave it at that.
Okay. Plenty to chew on all of that. But I think I want to move us to the topic of universal voting. And I want to let people know that actually EJ was one of the people who completely got me thinking about this idea. In September of 2015, he and William Galston, also of Brookings, wrote a paper called "Why We Need Universal Voting in America." Or wait a second, I'll read you the exact title. "The Case for Universal Voting: Why Making Voting a Civic Duty Would Enhance Our Democracy, Our Elections, and Improve Our Government." A very long, Brookings-ish title. But
the title is is short. The subtitle is endless.
Right. Anyway, but it made a really interesting case, and I realized that having been in the field of election reform and voting reform for like 35 years, I had never been in a conversation about this topic. It reminded me a little bit about single-payer healthcare, that for years and years and years, it was a total non-issue, even though it was functioning really well in Canada, 15 minutes away. But here it has been in Australia since 1924, many, many other countries, and yet this is an absolute non-discussion. And I started to think about why would that be? And the other thing that happened for me was that, again, after 35 years of working on these issues, I believe in these reforms that we've had, and they definitely have an impact. I'm a strong supporter of same-day registration, of early voting, of changing the way people with felony convictions can get their voting rights back. But if you really look honestly in terms of how much this has moved the needle, it's not that much, or it's not enough. It's significant, but not enough. And I started to think about, okay, what would be enough? And then I found EJ's paper. So when EJ came to Harvard a year ago, no, more than that now, almost 3 years ago, we started talking about it and realized maybe we could put something together here. So EJ, that's by way of giving you credit for thinking about this for a long time. Tell us why you think this is a conversation that people in the United States should have right now.
Thank you for that, and I'm grateful to Miles for really being the spark that got our group going. We can talk a bit about that if you're interested. I got interested in this idea for two primary reasons. The first is that for a variety of personal reasons and reasons of personal interest, I got very interested in Australian politics over the last 20, 25 years. And just watched as this system of, as they call it, compulsory attendance at the polls actually worked in their democracy. And I thought, well, we got the Australian ballot, the secret ballot from the Australians. Why not take another good idea from the Australians? If you go back to the origins of it in Australia, and we can talk about other countries, but as I say, this is my personal interest was sparked. In the 20s, the leaders of Australia were worried about their democracy, worried about falling turnout, and so they decided, well, voting is a civic duty, no less than, say, serving on a jury is a civic duty. Let's require everyone to cast a ballot, but let's also have a system that makes it as easy as possible for people to cast a ballot. If you look at Australia, there are a lot of polling places. They make registration as easy as possible. They have the advantage that federal elections are run federally so that you don't have some of the same problems we have with certain states trying to make voting harder while other states try to make it easier. But this system worked well, and it did a couple of things. Number one, in virtually all systems, they tend to be biased. All electoral systems tend to have a bias against the less well-off. The less well-off are often underrepresented in the electorate. And this created an electorate that was genuinely representative of the whole country. Electorates often, by the way, also probably overrepresent ideologues, and that this system encouraged people who were not necessarily deeply dug in on one side or the other to join the political debate. This encouraged political parties in their campaigning to have really broad outreach. It meant several other things. First of all, Australia also has a voting system, essentially an instant runoff system, a single transferable vote, which allows people to number their preferences all the way down the ballot. That also encourages people because they can come in and even if they support a minor party that has very little chance of winning, they can then offer a second or third preference to the party likely to win that is closer to their views. But even without that system, it encourages those folks into the electorate. Parties don't have to waste enormous sums of money on voter turnout because everyone is required to vote. And it led to, I think, a better and more inclusive debate. Australian politics, Lord knows, is a long way from perfect, as my Australian friends would be the first to point out. But this system worked. But the real spark for me in really embracing this came from the voter suppression efforts in our country. Because if voting is a civic duty, if you are required as a citizen to cast a ballot, and by the way, you can cast a blank ballot, you can draw a Mickey Mouse on the ballot, you're not required. This is not compulsory speech, which is why we on our task force, on our study group, believe it's constitutional. We have a lot of good work done by some legal scholars on this. You're not required to vote for anybody. You are required to attend the polls, or now, as we would have it, to mail a ballot in, with a lot of outs for reasons. I don't levy the fine very often. The fine is small. It's about $20, and it's really just a statement that this is a requirement to vote. If we had such a system in the United States, the task of all election officials, all the incentives are flipped around, that the job of every election official in every part of the country becomes making it as easy as possible for people to carry out the civic duty that they are now required to perform by law. Therefore, no voter ID laws, no restriction of access to the polls, more polling places rather than fewer, no excuse absentee voting, mail ballots. There are a whole series of things that can be done to make it far easier for people to vote. And if we make it a civic duty, all of these approaches to voting will become embedded in our system. And we believe that we can have a huge leap up. And that's the last thing I want to say. Miles and I both see this as a logical next step in the broad movement for voting rights. The Civil War amendments, the 14th and 15th in particular, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We see this as the next big step in a long progression to make our country genuinely democratic. And we're hopeful that simply by getting this idea into the public debate, we might get to people to think a bit differently about the right to vote, because the last thing I'll say is rights and duties come together as those who demanded equality in the creation of juries understood when that became a very important piece of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Actually, I'll just add I was just going to make that very point, but that one of the members of our working group and a colleague at the Kennedy School is Reverend Cornell William Brooks, formerly the head of the NAACP as well. And he made the point that we had a meeting with a lot of, about 20 key African-American voting rights leaders back in February. And Cornell made the point that a major demand of the civil rights movement in the South was the right to serve on juries, as he put it, the right to be compelled to serve on a jury, and for this very reason. So he's been a very, very strong supporter. EJ, let me ask you a question.
Miles, can I just pick up one quick question I can't resist?
Sure.
One question that appeared on the chat group. Joshua Palachik, I hope I have your name right, sir. Historically, other countries with universal voting included the communist and fascist autocracies. And obviously, we will get to some of the issues. I just want to make the point that there was universal voting for elections that weren't real elections in those cases. People were not required to make a choice among parties to have real power in their countries. They were required to show up in a show of support for a dictatorship. What we have in mind here is that the very idea of self-government includes responsibilities. We all accept that. We all accept that in every democracy, rights come with duties, duties come with rights, and they are intertwined. And so I just wanted to sort of talk about the fascist and communist examples, because we are talking about doing your civic duty in a free election, not being required to show your support for an undemocratic regime. And I think that is a fundamental difference. But I couldn't resist picking up your point, sir. Go ahead, Miles.
It's actually a perfect segue to the next question I was going to ask you. And that is, so before we open it up to everybody else, I just want you to address very directly, just so we get it on the record and on the table, so to speak, the two key objections that we have heard as we have talked about this. One is the basic libertarian objection that this is compulsory activity, it's compelled speech, and that it has an authoritarian cast to it, even if we're not a fascist or a communist country. So that's one. And then the second one is there is a strain of thought about how, if people don't want to vote, if they don't show up, if they don't take their civic responsibilities to vote, and we have a low turnout, that's not so terrible, that requiring everyone to vote will give us lots of, and I've seen this phrase, ignorant voters into the mix. So could you just deal with those two issues?
Yes, and that is, and this in a sense goes to the underlying point that the gentleman was making earlier. The idea of compulsion, the compulsion element is definitely a downer for a lot of voters. We are, if you don't mind my alluding to this, Miles, we were one of the only study groups in history that did careful polling to show that a majority currently opposes our idea in the country. We did a study where we found that a substantial majority believes that voting is a civic duty, but a substantial majority opposes our idea. However, that majority is made up of two parts. One part is strongly opposed to the idea. Another part is not. And as we see it, as I read the polling, about a quarter, a little over a quarter of the country supports this idea. Another quarter is at least open to arguments. We have elements of compulsion in our democracy now with conscientious objection allowed. And we, in our proposal, will have a strong conscientious objector out for people, thus Jehovah's Witnesses, the Amish groups, and others with a principled objection to voting will not be forced to violate their most deeply held principles. But we have a draft in the time of war. We have jury duty that is imposed upon everyone. People have to pay taxes. They can be jailed for evading their taxes. So it is not like that there are not elements of, there aren't requirements for democratic citizens. We believe this is a reasonable requirement. And again, to go just to the Australian example, this requirement is not enforced in any sort of police state way. Amber always remembers this number. I don't. But as I recall, in the end, only about 17% of the people in Australia even have to pay the $17 fine if they don't vote. If you have a good reason for not being able to cast your ballot, they generally let you avoid doing so. In our own proposal, we will also have a series of really tough provisions to make sure that these fines cannot be added on to other fines, that people can't be jailed for failing to vote. We'll have a small community service requirement for the very small number of people who end up being fined. So this is a very small element of compulsion, far less serious than, say, what we have for jury duty or on tax paying. Your second question, Miles, was
the question about sort of attracting ignorant voters, or if people really cared to vote, they would. So why are we requiring them to?
I think if you are worried about so-called ignorant voters, you can't be a Democrat in the first place. A small d Democrat. I am very impressed by a book that a former Harvard professor, later at UC San Diego, who tried to teach me statistics, I always try to say it that way, a great scholar called Sam Popkin, who wrote a book called The Reasoning Voter, where Sam showed that most voters operate on what he called low information rationality, and to oversimplify a much more interesting argument. What Sam showed is that most voters who cast ballots and most voters who simply think about politics end up supporting the candidates they would have supported, the parties they would have supported, given their values, given their views, that they would have done if they had invested hours and hours and hours in trying to make that choice. They operate, as I say, on what he called low information rationality. So I've always just pushed back against the idea of the so-called ignorant voter. But secondly, democracy is premised on the idea that ordinary people, regardless of their education, regardless of their income, regardless of their status, have an equal right to make the choices that are going to affect their own lives. They have an equal right to cast a ballot for the party whose values they agree with, the party that will serve their interests, or some combination of the two. If you're worried about so-called ignorant voters, I think you really can't be a small d Democrat. Maybe you're some kind of a small r Republican who believes that the right to the franchise should be restricted to certain groups. But if you're for an open franchise, then you should want everyone to participate, because having everyone in the game I think creates a sense of inclusion and legitimacy to the decisions that a democratically elected government will have to make. There are other things that contribute to that legitimacy, but I think that's the notion of broad participation is key to ending some of the alienation that we have now. It's not a magic cure, but I think it will be helpful.
Great. Got a lot of questions here that are kind of in and around topics. One is a question about what level of government is this appropriate for? Should this be federal legislation? Is it more directed at the states? How do you see this?
Well, we've talked about this a lot in the study group. One of the problems the United States has with turnout is because we tend to have more elections than most of the other democracies, not all of the other democracies, but we have an awful lot of elections at different times of year, at the very local level, at the state level, and at the national level. The timing of these elections is at different moments. The way we have been thinking about it in our study group is that my sort of core hope is that we could have this at least for national presidential elections or national elections. On the other hand, I think that given that this idea will bubble up from the bottom, I think communities trying this out in their own local elections may be the ways in which we will get some of the first experiments in this idea, much as places like Cambridge, to pick one example, not at random, have had the instant runoff system for a long time that is now finally being picked up on a broader scale, for example, up in Maine recently by referendum. I think that this will be a matter of choice for localities because we have decentralized elections. I would, if I had my way, which I don't think I will anytime soon, I would like to try it for presidential elections and then see how it works and move downward. But given our federal system, we're going to have it probably from the bottom up, and we're going to see what happens. I would just point out that if a certain number of cities in a state decided to have it, other localities might have an incentive to create such a system because city turnouts would be bigger and other parts of the state would want their parts represented equally, so they too might have an interest in higher turnout. I'm hoping, if you will, for a race to the top where localities, counties compete with each other to try to produce the highest turnouts.
Okay. All right. Keep the cards and letters coming in. There is a question about. I'll ask two at once. One about fraud. Do we have any information about voter fraud and whether this might increase it? And then secondly, what about civic education?
Yeah, I've been one of those many people who've been part of the movement for more civics education in the schools. I would actually like a requirement that every student work on a political campaign of some kind that would go parallel to the service requirement many schools have issued. I'm sure that won't come to pass because local school boards would be worried that many students would choose to work on a local school board race and throw out some incumbent school board member. But so even putting aside my dream of everyone having some political experience, I think civics education is vital. And I think there is a curriculum sitting out there that could be generalized. Anyone who's had a kid go through high school knows, if they've had been fortunate enough to take it, that there is an AP state, federal, local, state, and federal government class that could easily be generalized to a broader group of students. I would love to have a civics education linked to what is being called by some a media literacy movement right now, given how complicated media are, just to make students more sophisticated about the information they consume. So I am all for this. I'd like to see us do it. I think there are a lot of teachers around the country who want this to happen, some school principals. So I'm very strongly for this. I don't think it's a requirement to have before we have our idea come into place, but I devoutly hope we have more of it.
You know, there have been 3 or 4 questions here. Let me just switch gears a teeny bit about the very question about the kind of the penalties and the fines, and do they not? Obviously, this is a question that we've had to think about. You know, disproportionately affect people least able to pay. Is this another way that potentially, you know, laws can be used as a what you call it, an attack on communities of color? So you're sort of like, now all of a sudden you have to vote, and you can get in trouble for not voting. And if you have a felony conviction, you can might vote inadvertently and feel like you were compelled to vote. Anyway, what about just talk a little bit about the kind of potential regressiveness and racial disparity of penalties, even if they're at a level of, you know, call it $20 as a fine.
You know, and I'd love you to come in on this, Miles, because this study group has really been, you kicked it off and has been such a joint project that I want to say a couple of things, and I'd like you to come in and fill in some of the details. It's a very legitimate concern, and one of the things we did with our study group is we have very consciously reached out to a variety of constituencies that would be affected by this, including, by the way, people who run elections, including secretaries at the local level, including secretaries of state. But in particular, we reached out to the civil rights community, had an extraordinary meeting with leaders of virtually all of the voting rights groups in the country. It was a very exciting meeting, and also a group of advocates on behalf of immigrants, a variety of Latino groups and others who care passionately about immigrants. The thing that was striking about the meeting with civil rights groups is that this issue of how fines are accumulated and then used at times to jail and literally oppress people of color, it definitely came up in the civil rights meeting, although we found, and correct me if I'm wrong, Miles, we found that on the whole, the balance was in favor of the idea because of how strong a pushback it would be against voter suppression. That's why in our study group report, we are very careful to lay out that this cannot be used in this way, that there will be many ways in which the fine can be waived. The last thing we want this to be is one more penalty that goes into pre-existing systems of oppression. It was particularly striking to us how much fear exists in the community of immigrants, recent immigrants, that a penalty like this would be used against immigrants by local officials. The Joe Arpaio example came up as just one more way to oppress immigrants. That is also a problem we are grappling with in the report. I think there are ways we can prevent this, but we are acutely alive to the problem that this raises. Why don't you pick it up, Miles, because we have talked about this together so much and with so many of the advocates outside.
Well, an interesting thing, an experience from the working group has been the series of meetings that EJ just mentioned. We had one with a group of kind of democracy leaders and election officials in Minneapolis, which actually gives me an excuse to give a little bit of a shout out to Cecily Hines, who has worked tirelessly on the working group, but also is a democracy advocate in Minneapolis, with the civil rights, the African American community, civil rights and voting rights leaders, and separately with the Latinx and the APIA communities. EJ really did. I'll just say I was struck by several of the comments that were made by African American voting rights leaders. Derek Johnson was at this meeting, the new head of the NAACP, who said that there were 4 priorities for the NAACP's election work. And one was about the census, one was about voter suppression, one was about gerrymandering, redistricting. But the 4th point that he made as something that the NAACP is pushing is compulsory voting. That was his term, which we don't use because you're not actually compelled to do vote. You're compelled to participate one way or another, slight compulsion. And Donna Brazil was there, who also was very, very strongly supportive of this as a way of really changing the character of the electorate. I was taken aback, as EJ was, by how much people in the Latinx community felt like no matter what you know, kind of well-meaning liberals tried to do, the people like Joe Arpaio and their ilk will figure out a way to come and screw us with it. And that's obviously a kind of a terrifying idea, but important, really important for us to hear that perspective. So we will certainly make the point in the report, you cannot control absolutely everything, you know, with the adoption of a policy. But I think, you know, the strong sense would be that where this is adopted it is as a commitment to widen voting, not to undercut it.
By the way, I just want to say I'm seeing all these questions come up. There are some excellent questions here. I just want to thank you all. I think we should save these questions but we should read every single question that pops up here before we put out the report, Miles. Thank you all.
That's right.
There are a lot of them we have grappled with, thank goodness, but they are very, and I also, Carol Brand, a shout out for DC Politics and Prose as a place to buy EJ's book. Order online and P&P will mail the book to you. I will similarly shout out the Harvard bookstore down the street from you. This is a moment when we should try to keep our great bookstores open. And even if you don't buy my book, get some book from them. Go ahead.
Let's see. I'm looking for questions. Look, I guess one of the questions that keeps coming around is why would people who are currently in office support this when it completely dramatically changes and makes much more uncertain the character of it? And secondly, you know, we make the point, or people have made the point, that this will make elections less polarized. Can you put a case for that out?
Yeah, all elections in the United States involve, all election strategies involve a mix of polarization and mobilization. I'm sorry, I don't mean polarization, mobilization. I mean mobilization or persuasion. And you always have these arguments in campaigns that the key thing to us is to turn out our base. And if we turn out our base, whatever that base is, we will be better off. The other side says, no, our base isn't big enough. We need to persuade some other people to join us. What this would do is, I think, highlight persuasion because the need to spend enormous number of resources, first of all, on mobilization would be obviated, because this tends to produce, I think, actual turnout in Australia amounts to about 80% of the electorate. It's even higher. Again, Amber, come in on these numbers because you've always had them at the tip of your fingers. It produces very high turnout. This would mean that politicians in a campaign really have an interest in making arguments to swing voters, to new voters. The campaigns could spend more of their time advancing ideas, trying to persuade people toward ideas, because you wouldn't be spending so much of your time on mobilization. Now, for some people, that's not a selling point. There are probably folks who would prefer a mobilization election. I can imagine some people on the left, although I would hope that people on the left would want the democratizing element of this, but I can certainly imagine some folks on the ideological right who say, right, we want an election based on the base, because at this moment in history, we might be more likely to win such an election. So there might be objections to this, and let's say, in fairness, on both sides. But I think that if you have an election that's based on persuasion and based on argument, that you will have a better democracy and more of a case for what a party will do when it takes power. So I am for persuasion as a general purpose of a democratic election, small d democratic election campaign. Have we lost Miles? Oh, there you are. Miles, you're muted.
Yeah, I actually got thrown off for a minute, so I was delighted to see that all the rest of you were still here.
This is the first time anyone in history has succeeded in muting Miles Rappaport. I hope it doesn't become a habit. Go ahead, Miles.
Okay. The issue about voter fraud has come up on several questions. Do we think that this has the potential for increasing voter fraud? Is there any data from Australia or other countries where they use this that we are aware of?
There is very little evidence of voter fraud in Australia, or that they have any higher rate of voter fraud than any country in the world. As a lot of people on the call know, the amount of certainly in-person voter fraud is very low. There have been a very small number of examples, say with mail ballot or absentee ballot systems. There was recently an election that had to be rerun in North Carolina because of corrupt voter harvesting, an absentee ballot effort that was trying actually to keep ballots out on behalf of a Republican candidate. It forced a race to be rerun. The data on voter fraud, and by the way, the states that have had mail voting, for example, for a significant period of time, like Washington State or Colorado, have not had high levels of voter fraud. So I do not see voter fraud as being increased by this in any way. And voter fraud has been a remarkably small problem in our country for a long time. Whenever we talk about voter fraud, I just love my favorite argument over it. In the olden days in Illinois, when the Chicago Democratic machine used to be accused, sometimes fairly, of voting dead bodies in Chicago, the Democrats in Chicago would point to voter fraud in Republican areas and say, for every corpse that votes in Chicago, a cow or a pig votes downstate. And they would argue that the fraud was balanced out. But we don't even have that level of fraud now in our elections as we once did.
Okay. All right. I'm a little bit conscious of time, although we've hardly lost anybody so far. So I wish anybody who's dying to ask a question. Tova, do you want to, anything that you've been watching the thread more closely than I, anything that you want to make sure that we get to?
So we have an actual Australian with us.
Oh,
who has actual experience with this system and has some thoughts on it. And I've asked her to kindly maybe chime in on some of these questions from her perspective as an Australian. If we can unmute Erin, and I don't know where she is in the queue here. But James, if you can help me to unmute Erin.
Is there an Erin in the house that can be on? Erin Gregor?
Yes.
Hello.
Oh, there you are. How are you?
Thank you so much.
Very well, thank you. And thank you so much for hosting this conversation.
I love hearing Australian accents. Bless you.
Yeah, so I completely agree with a lot of the points that have been made. And I think that a lot of the concern that I'm seeing in the thread was that this was sort of a threat to people's freedoms, and that one of the ways that people feel like they exercise their freedom in American elections is by not voting. And I think that the difference is a cultural one in Australia, where this is just a norm. Everyone knows, exactly as you were saying, you pay taxes, you do jury duty, and you go vote. And I think that there's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation in the US, where people are like, oh, well, you would need to make it really accessible before you could make it compulsory. And I think that what we've seen instead in Australia is that because it is compulsory, therefore you have to make everything more accessible. You have to have mail-in ballots, you have to have pre-voting, you have to have a lot of polling locations. People walk probably less than 2 blocks to their closest polling location, except obviously in rural areas. And I think there's a big culture around voting, and it's a really fun thing that people do. It's always on a Saturday. You go there with your neighbors, you go, get a sausage sizzle. I recommended looking up a democracy sausage to see the culture around that. So I think that it's going to be tough to shift in America because of the different interpretation of what your rights are. But I do think that there could be a generational shift around this where, say, they made it a bigger norm and a bigger responsibility in civics education amongst high schoolers as they're getting to voting age, and then you can shift that norm over time.
Could I ask Aaron, stay there if you would. First of all, Miles, sign Aaron up to join the end of our study group. Bless you for that contribution, Aaron. Just a thought that I wanted to ask you, if I could, Aaron, that the culture of voting in Australia was actually created by the system of compulsory voting. No, in other words, that the reform, it's obviously, fortunately, neither of us is so old that we were alive when this was put into place, but that having this as a requirement turned it into a norm that rarely has to be enforced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so I actually admitted in the thread, embarrassingly, I have received a fine for not voting actually in my state election. We have compulsory voting at every level of the voting. And so I was traveling at the time. I missed the fact that I had actually left the state, but my address was still tied to my parents. And so my mom had to call up and explain, like, my daughter is traveling. And so got me out of the fine. I do think that the way that a fine is created and enforced, ends up making it more or less regressive. And so I totally agree that you don't want this to be penalizing people that, can't physically make it to the polls or have a conscientious objection to voting. But I do think there is a way that it triggers people to think, I should be voting. And then you can obviously work your way back from there in making sure that it's not penalizing the wrong people. But I think that it comes back to the points around it being very accessible for people, it being, easy such that like it would take a genuine mistake or a very active decision to not vote in order to end up with a fine. And then I think that this comes back to the piece as well, tying this with ranked choice voting, so that people feel like there are options out there and that their vote is not going to waste if they don't identify with the 2 major parties.
Thank you. We're not going to propose in our report ranked choice, although I'm very strongly in favor of ranked choice for a whole bunch of reasons. But thank you for that very much.
No worries.
That's great. All right, we probably have maybe 5 minutes left. EJ, there is a question from Alex Kesar about whether there is any movement in Australia to repeal compulsory voting.
Oh, that's good. Aaron, why don't we ask Aaron? I am unaware of one. I know there are friends of mine, Alex, in the Labor Party say that the other side from them, the center right, might like to do that, might like to repeal it, but there's no consensus in the country to do it. Aaron, I'm unaware of any effort to repeal it, but I could be wrong. Are you aware of any effort to repeal it?
Yeah, I'm also unaware of any efforts to repeal. And honestly, like, Australia is pretty progressive on a bunch of issues that are very controversial here. So we have universal health coverage, we have gun control, we have compulsory voting. And so those are things that honestly the 2 major parties would never really backtrack on, because they're just norms in our society that people have come to live with and get used to. So there may be some sort of fringe components of the Australian population that don't want to vote and probably do get fines and fight against them and kind of exercise their freedom of speech that way. But I don't think there's any mainstream movement that's pushing back against this, because it's just kind of a way of being in Australia.
Could I ask Alex to unmute himself? I'm just curious what one of the great experts on the right to vote and its history in our country thinks of this idea, at the risk of his blowing up our idea, Miles. I just really want to know what Alex thinks of this. Can you share your views, Alex, wherever you are? I don't see you.
Yeah, no, I think I've made myself visible now. And can you, am I audible also? Can
Yes,
hear
you
me?
are very
Yes,
audible.
you are.
Um, well, you know, this may shock you, EJ. No, I'm in favor of this. I think this is I think this is a very good idea. I think, you know, I'm cheered by the evolution of the Australian example. You know, there is, as I mentioned in my little question, you know, the course of this has been less clear in, or less, it's been rockier in Brazil, which also has compulsory voting, but you know, Brazil seems to make its history rocky whenever it can. But I think, you know, there's an anecdote I can tell, but I'll risk telling it again. But you know, there was a movement towards a significant movement towards compulsory voting in the early 20th century. And in fact, some states, including I think Massachusetts,
Yeah.
The Constitution has a provision that would enable compulsory voting if the legislature to do it. And part of what was going on at that point, I mean, it was a different political thrust, but I think it was coming out of the same democratic impulses that we feel. But part of what that movement was also about was this sense that the urban machines were bringing out poor, ignorant immigrant voters in droves, while respectable people were staying home. And thus, we wanted to have compulsory voting to get all those respectable people to go out there and outvote the immigrants. Now, that was based on completely impressionistic evidence about who was voting. There was a widespread consensus. You know, the Irish were coming out, the Italians were coming out, you know, good people were staying home. And then in the 1920s, the first serious empirical studies were done about who was voting and who wasn't. And it turned out that the reverse was true. It turned out that middle-class people were in fact voting in large numbers, and turnout rates in the immigrant communities were quite low. And at that point, a lot of reformers kind of said, never mind.
Right. Yeah,
okay.
exactly. I just want to say, Alex, I'm not surprised that you're for this. I would have been deeply disappointed if you weren't, but I wanted to hear what your view was. So I'm grateful.
And I think the chances, you know, the shifts that could result from this would be profound. And so, you know, I'm for it. I'm with you, EJ. Recruit me however you'd like.
Oh, bless your soul. Thank you.
Alex, also, you know, there have been a couple of questions in the chat about the Electoral College, which of course you also are an expert on, and whether this would help to move people towards getting rid of the Electoral College, because that is also something that makes people feel like their votes don't matter in certain states, at least in the presidential elections.
I've written for a long time against the Electoral College. I've supported these efforts in state legislatures to pledge the state's electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. The problem is, it's very unlikely we'll succeed anytime soon in amending the Constitution because it requires 3/4 of the states, and smaller states obviously have an interest in the Electoral College exactly as it is because it overrepresents them. So I would cheer efforts to eliminate the Electoral College, but we don't think our idea hangs on getting that done.
But does it also the movement in that direction as well? Because people, right, will want their votes to matter if they have to vote.
Right.
Well, let me say two things. First, EJ,
Alex, let me interrupt for a second before you start. I want to hear you, but we are starting to lose people, so I want to bring this to a close in a minute. EJ, I'm going to give you the last word at the very end, but I also want to have a comment from Archon, who is the director of the Democracy Program at ASH and a fabulous colleague who has supported this all along. So
can Alex, can you
Alex,
make your
Archon, and then EJ.
Yeah, good. I want to hear what Alex's point.
Okay, quickly, the small state argument for the unfeasibility of electoral reform is bogus. It is not true. reasons spelled out in a forthcoming book. Bogus.
Oh, here, I can't wait.
B, I that having compulsory voting might supplement pressures to get rid of the Electoral College, but I'm not sure. I think the two may just operate independently. And now let me turn it over to Archon.
Thank you.
Archon? Do we have to unmute you? Hang on.
Yeah, I got it. I'm on mute.
Okay.
I just
Hey,
wanted
Archon.
to thank you. Hey, how are you doing, EJ?
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Just thank everyone for coming and for this fantastic conversation, especially Miles and EJ and Tova, and then Alex for jumping in with his characteristic wealth of expertise and knowledge. I think this has just been a great conversation. It's nice to look at the big picture in an ambitious way for democracy in a way that's not completely encompassed by the COVID crisis that we're in. And so it's a refreshing kind of relieving conversation in that regard. I do think that one of the lasting effects of the COVID crisis will be to compel all of us to look across states and countries to see what's going on, look outside of our own little worlds. And the Universal Voting Project does that very well by trying to scan out around the world, look for some best practices in Australia, Belgium, Brazil, other places, and say, hey, would that be a good idea for us? And what would it take to move that forward a little bit at the state, federal, or even local level? So thank you guys very much. And I thought this was an enormously successful conversation. Over to you, EJ.
Well, I just want to close by saying thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you for the extraordinary list of questions that we couldn't get to, but that I'm going to read carefully as we close our deliberations on this document that we're putting out fairly soon. I just want to close with two of my favorite quotations on democracy, which are debatable, each of them actually, but one, and they're from two very different sources. One is from Al Smith, who famously said, the only cure for the problems of democracy is more democracy. And while there are a lot of people who disagree with that, I feel that strongly that in many ways, including more voices, in the words of the anthem, lift every voice, including more voices in our public deliberation will enrich it and improve it. And that is one of the reasons we are in favor of this proposal. The other, which I have quoted 5 million times, so the last line of Michael Sandel's first book, when democracy goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. And the point of making democracy work is to realize that aspiration, and I think that reality that Michael describes, that we live in a very individualistic society. I think there are healthy forms of individualism about independence. There are unhealthy forms of radical individualism that understate the ways in which our fates are interlinked. If anything should remind us of how interlinked our fates are, it's a pandemic. And I'm hoping that this pandemic, whatever damage it causes, will make all of us a little bit, and I'll use a small d here, a little bit more democratic. Thank you, Miles, for putting this together. I'm really grateful for the conversation.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. One of the advantages of having people register in advance is we now do have all of your email addresses. So we will read the comments that have been made. They will have an impact on the report, and we will get back to you in some way with a progress report as soon as we can. So I want to thank everybody very much for coming. Really enjoyed it, and we learned a lot. We learned a lot from it. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.